Hello, I am a writer by the name of Booker, especially a horror author. I've always had a passion for prose, but I've never been able to devote all of my attention to it because of time constraints and other artistic pursuits. I've never really been able to identify why, but my love of horror and discovering new methods to frighten others with words tends to return no matter what I'm doing with my life. I've had an almost obsessive fascination with the macabre and otherworldly since I was a young child. Frankenstein, Dracula, and screaming skulls covered in viscera filled the margins of my notebooks, and I had a year-round fascination with monster movies and Halloween. My bookshelves were overrun by urban legends and ghost stories, and the spooky films I tried so hard to like were haunting my nightmares. However, no matter how much I immerse myself in the horror genre, something always prevents me from fully appreciating it. The crushing fear that comes with it will keep me up until daylight, even if I stay up until 3 in the morning reading r/no sleep or watching scary movies on Netflix. Fear that keeps me moving quickly when I get up in the dark to fetch a glass of water or stroll alone to my car at night. Fear that knows Bathsheba or Pennywise are waiting for me in the dark, and that never fails to give a face to every bump in the night. Why is it that during the witching hour of the night, I am constantly afraid of what might be waiting for me since I've already experienced it? This is my ghost story, and my name is Booker. Even while it might not be the scariest thing you've ever read, I find it to be quite real and frightening. My family was really impoverished when I was a child. I didn't realize how horrible things were for us because it was all I knew. My dad was working graveyard shifts at a paper industry, while my mother was earning her way through college. Until I was 6 years old, about the time my dad began pursuing his bachelor's degree, we didn't own a home. We rented before that. When I was younger, we rented 3 different homes. We shared a duplex with an extremely erratic family, whose yelling fights frequently reverberated through our walls, disrupting sleep, meals, and the overall tranquility and safety of our house. Our first pet and my childhood best friend Chloe, the tabby cat, lived in a charming brown house on the outskirts of town. My kindergarten was located on Evans Street, next to a white house. It was a horrible house, the Evans house. An elderly woman who lived 2 houses down rented the Evans residence to us. The house was, for want of a better word, shabby, but it was sufficient for our 3-person household and Chloe. Upon entering the living room through the front door, you found yourself in a corridor with a sharp grated vent on the floor. I used to frequently cut my fingers on this vent while playing games with Chloe and crawling around on the floor. The kitchen/dining area, which linked to the computer room, was to the right of the hallway. My room, my parents' room, and the attic door right above my room were all accessible by turning left. My parents are usually quite evasive when I discuss the Evans house with them. I believe this is intentional. While we were there, they both experienced a lot of spooky stuff. In the computer room, my mother will mostly talk about the continual sense of being watched and the sporadic feeling of someone touching her shoulder. I found the attic to be the center of weird activity, but the computer room seemed to be the spot where she was most in tune with whatever was in that house. Like the weather, my feelings concerning the attic fluctuated. On certain days, I would almost implore my father to accompany me up there to hear spooky tales. On other days, I had no desire to engage in it at all. The room was incredibly cramped, with dark green walls that resembled low-tide seaweed. That dark green wallpaper is the only thing that comes to mind when I think of how that space made me feel. Although I was never personally impacted by staying in the attic, its vibe undoubtedly permeated my room. I was a tried and true nightlight kid. As darkness fell, my mania for horror and my vivid imagination betrayed me from an early age, resulting in the debilitating fear I described before. I am afraid of my house in the dark, as well as the dark itself. My nightlight at this time in my life was a Tweety bird. A yellow beacon in the night, Tweety's bulbous head would flip on and my terror would vanish. I used to switch on the nightlight before turning out the light in my room as part of my evening routine. The dash from the light switch to my bed was always hurried and frantic, even with the nightlight. But first, I had to switch on my nightlight. One night, I pressed the light switch while half sleeping, not even considering my routine. Panic struck as soon as I understood what I had done, and the room went dark. As a scared 5-year-old, I booked it to my bed and hid under the covers instead of using the apparent solution of putting the lights back on because I was still right next to the switch. My fear increased as the night wore on. I was too terrified to shout out to my parents, and they were too deep in sleep to be aware of my predicament, particularly after the faces began to emerge from my closet door. I could see the shapes growing on the door when I peered into my room's darkness. This was different from the shapes my imagination had previously conjured up in the dark. It was too clear, too bright. The zombies on the VHS case for Michael Jackson's Thriller, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and the Pazuzu-possessed Regan were all just a few of the faces that quickly pushed their way out of my head and started to push their way out of my closet door and the wall around it, as though the floaters and sporadic lights that one sees when closing their eyes have made the decision to manifest and launch an assault. This moment seemed to go on forever. I was immobile. I was unable to yell. I was unable to cry. All I could do was lie there and watch as the faces stretched and swelled, all of them staring at the little kid. Although I've never felt very comfortable talking about religion, the moment I'm going to share with you has, in all honesty, been the only firm foundation of faith I've ever maintained in my life. Above the grating vent in the hallway, a white light emerged. It started moving slowly in my direction. Its intended route from the hallway to my bedside pulsed and raced like runway lights. It shaped itself into a woman as the light approached. The darkness and anxiety vanished in an instant when the white woman approached me. Her features emerged as she approached the side of my bed. I slept out as she placed her hand on my chest. As I was telling my parents what had happened the following morning, I realized who the woman in white was. When I pointed to the framed sepia photo of my great-grandmother, my mother's grandmother, and explained that she was the one who had visited me in the middle of the night, my mother started to cry. As I attempted to put together what was going on in the Evans family, my conversations with my parents about it intensified later in life, throughout my high school years. My parents informed me about the elderly woman we rented from and her husband, about the blow to his head. They believed he did it in the attic. That realization brought back a lot of memories, including the first time the attic showed me its actual character. I heard a man giggle one night as I was lying in bed with Tweety lighting up the room. It was a loud laugh, not a small one, nor was it innocent, crazy, thriller on acid like Vincent Price in the end. This and the night my dad rented The Shining from the video store were linked for a long time in my merged childhood memories. That time Dad rented The Shining and I heard Jack Nicholson laugh and it scared me, was how I always rationalized this recollection. The problem is that I can still clearly recall the chuckle I heard that evening. The Shining is another movie I've seen too many times to count. Jack never really lets out a good, loud laugh in that movie, despite all the wild crap he does. And what frightened me the most that evening, that didn't happen, that I had to convince myself. That's my tale. I hope you found it entertaining, and perhaps it even gave you a little fright, because the shadows from the Evans house still keep me awake on some evenings. There was a loud knock on the front door a few weeks ago while I was in the kitchen eating Cheerios and fiddling with my phone. The policy is here. You know, I almost shit my pants. On the stool next to me, I had a joint rolled up in my backpack. However, I reasoned that they couldn't possibly be coming to get me for a joint. That's crazy. Open the door. Like I said, I've been practicing stillness for almost a year, and as of late, I've been meditating frequently. Open the door. Dad had already departed for work, and Mom was up in the shower. They continued to pound on the door. Despite my extreme fear, I didn't think I had many options. It was indeed the police. When I stood up and looked through the side window near the door, there were 4 of them, 4 police officers are hammering at the door. I inhaled deeply before opening it. One of the cops, a large, burly man who appeared capable of crushing me with one hand, asked, "Calvin Dunlop?" This was the hand on his gun holster. "Go outside. You're all right now. Lois Brown, is she inside? My mom is up taking a shower, I guess." The huge guy was caught off guard by this. He turned to face his friends. Then, a female police officer raised her voice. She had a good appearance. She's sweet, but not pleasant enough for me to trust. She said, "I'm not sure what they did to you, Calvin, but you're safe now. Your parents are waiting at the station. Come with me." At that point, I began to feel a little lightheaded. Mom is taking a shower while Dad is at work. What is this? Why are you all here? One of the guys in the back said something that I heard. "Jesus," he said. "He believes that they are his parents." The big man cleared his throat. "Go outdoors, son. We must enter and take Lois Brown into custody." Though it was difficult to think at all, I recalled all of those police dramas, films, and other media. "Do you have a warrant?" "Excuse me," I said. There was a piece of paper in the hand that one of the guys at the back thrust forward. I assumed it was a warrant, even though I had no idea what the hell it stated. I went outside. I responded, "She is upstairs. Be careful, because she's probably naked." "So where's Andrea?" she asked. I was led down the stairs into one of the police cars by a lady officer who took me by the arm. As I looked around, I noticed the others entering the house. I questioned, "Am I in trouble?" She said, "Calvin, you're safe now." I questioned why they kept referring to me as Calvin and who the devil he was. Why in the world were they taking Mom into custody? The policeman held the rear door wide and said, "Come in." Then, as in the movies, "Be mindful of your head." What should I have done? We drove away once I got in. She questioned, "You're not hurt or anything?" "No," I replied. Just, perplexed. "It's my lazy, dumb fingers. You can have a quick visit with your folks once we arrive at the station. We have a lot of questions for you, though. I apologize. We must hear your version of events, even though I know it is extremely painful and frightening for you." She was correct when she said it was frightening. When we arrived at the station, a guy and a woman were waiting by the front door. They were in tears. They were something I had never seen in my life. "It's okay," the female police officer responded as she opened my door. "You are welcome to visit them." I got to my feet, but I didn't approach them. Both of them rushed over to me and gave me a cunning bear hug. They sobbed as they repeatedly said, "Calvin." I suppose they also believed that I was this Calvin figure. However, I wasn't. My name was Nick. I finally gasped out some words, though it was difficult to breathe in that hug. "Who are you all?" They drew aside and gave me a startled look. The man said, "It's Dad and Mom." He looked at the policeman curiously. She remarked, He seems to be confused at the moment. It is crucial that we get him inside and continue the inquiry because of this. Mr. and Mrs. Dunlop, as soon as possible, we will have him back." We began strolling down the pathway to the front door, after she took my arm once more. "Wait!" exclaimed Mr. Dunlop. "Just a moment!" He reached into his rear pocket and took out a wallet. He moved closer, opened it, and held it out to me. "See, Calvin? That's who we are." A photo of a man holding a small child on his lap was hidden by a small plastic shield. I think the child was around 5 years old. He may have resembled me in appearance at that age, but the photo was small and didn't impress me in any way. Additionally, I was beginning to feel uneasy due to the intense expression on this stranger's face. "Oh yes," I replied. "Nice. Well, officer, I had better get inside immediately." Hours passed while we were in that room. Hell was the place. I sobbed, threw up, and yanked out a bunch of hair. They wanted to know if I had ever been harmed by my parents, who they dubbed Mr. and Mrs. Brown. No, obviously not. They inquired about my recollections on the day of the abduction. They asked, "What on earth are you people discussing? What is the premature abduction? I asked. What is the abduction? They wanted to know if I ever tried to get in touch with anyone for assistance. What is the source of the help? They were certain that I was Calvin Dunlop, this child. However, I wasn't. I said at the end of my rope, look, you guys made a huge mistake. Can I leave now and head home? Or education? Or somewhere other than here? The investigator, a man with an absurd mustache, inquired, want to spend a moment with your parents? I exclaimed, yes, for the first time that day that I felt relieved. No, wait. I want to see my real parents, not the two strange people who used to hug me. Mustache let out a sigh. Calvin, those are your biological parents. Hold on, look. He looked in the mirror. I was aware that it was a trick mirror. Once, more from the police dramas. Jerry, could you please bring my laptop in here? After a short while, this Jerry guy entered the room with the laptop and placed it in front of Mustache. After fiddling around for a while, Mustache turned the computer over so I could view it. Look at it, he said. Go through those photos. They numbered in the hundreds. Me as a newborn, a toddler, a young child, and so forth. Some of the images I recognized. At different points in time, my parents had revealed them to me. We even had some of them printed out and displayed on our walls. But others, well, there were many. Of them in the group of folks who had given me hugs, the individuals posing as Calvin's parents, the individuals asserting that I was Calvin. At that moment, I threw up. I'll share what they told me with you. I was abducted by Lois and Andrew Brown 10 years ago when I was 5 years old. No one is certain how or why. We were all relocated from Florida to a small Maine hamlet. They had social security cards, birth certificates, and all that junk. They thus relocated us to Maine, put me in school, found employment, and so forth. My real parents, meantime, were going crazy, phoning the FBI, affixing posters to telephone poles, and supposedly even featuring me on a milk box at one point. One morning, they had just woken up, and I was gone. The problem is, that's not how I recall it. Although I don't recall much from that age, I most certainly don't recall Mr. and Mrs. Dunlop. My parents, Andrew and Lois Brown, are in my memory. I do remember them, but they are vague blobs of memory. I do recall that after living in Florida, we relocated to Maine. None of that can be explained by the police. I must have been indoctrinated, they say. Although they didn't use that word, they intended to use it. However, I don't believe you can simply enter someone's head and alter their memories. It's not just memories either. It's an emotion. Back in Florida, I now reside with Mr. and Mrs. Dunlop. I pleaded with everyone to allow me to remain in Maine, where my friends reside. Hell, I've nearly finished high school, and now I have to go and begin anew? I haven't seen since that morning the Browns are the folks I still consider to be my biological parents. I've gotten meaningful feedback from people who I know are my parents, but they aren't doing anything about what's happening. More than anything, it's a feeling, as I say. There is a problem with the Dunlops. They don't do shit most of the time. They don't say anything. They just sit there and stare at me. They force me to have dinner with them at the table, but they remain silent. They munch silently. Then, at random, one of them will say something ostentatious like, "How was your day today, son?" You know, a little too enthusiastic. "Well, it was terrible. I'm really scared and I don't know what's going on," is what I'll say. After saying, "Isn't that something?" they will resume eating in silence. I'm not sure. It doesn't feel right, but perhaps the entire situation messed them up. Even though Lois and Andrew were jerks, they reminded me of my parents. They are currently in prison somewhere. I have no idea where. The doorbell rang again, and Peter Pan left the dining room. The lack of media coverage of this is another issue that is seriously bothering me. Nowhere, not in Florida, not in Maine. You'd think you'd hear something about this, wouldn't you? I'm not trying to sound significant. It's an absurd tale, isn't it? When I approached the Dunlops about it, they told me that they had experienced a media circus when I vanished, and that they didn't want to experience one again. Perhaps it's not so strange after all. Perhaps I've watched too many films where the plot is constantly revealed to the media. However, it appears that I should have noticed anything. For example, what about my Maine-based friends? They would be discussing this, wouldn't they? Speaking of pals, ever since this horror show started, I haven't been able to communicate with them. They stopped responding to my texts and all unfriended me. I texted Corey like 1,000 times, but he was the only one who ever responded. I'm not supposed to talk to you, Calvin, and after what you did, I don't want to talk to you, he replied in his reply. What? Following my actions? After that, I texted Corey 1,000,000 times more. What did you hear? Come on, man, tell me who told you what. I don't think you heard the real story, etc. That's where I am now. I'm completely terrified out. I have no idea what is genuine. As if I had a choice. I'm not sure what I want to be honest about. What I can do, I don't know. I have no idea who I am. Please, I implore you, tell me what to do if you have any suggestions that may assist me resolve this. My mother, who was 68 years old, passed away quietly in her sleep 4 months ago. Her untimely death didn't exactly break my heart. For more than 2 decades, we had been separated. I hadn't even seen her since my last departure from home to attend college. There were also no phone calls, only the occasional Christmas card, exchanged with a short, impersonal note. Growing up, my mother had never been a very kind or caring person. In hindsight, I believe it most likely sprang from her own challenging upbringing as a second-generation Irish immigrant in a big working-class household. Her older brother was also present, although he had killed himself when she was just 10 years old. Due to our radically different personalities, we had never gotten along and had frequently clashed, especially as I hit puberty. She had been a hard-working, strict, frigid, and frequently harsh teen, while I had been an arrogant, irreverent, carefree one. An experience that defied my efforts to be an easygoing member of society. I went to the city to pursue a profession after graduating from college in 2006. I was the first person in my family to complete high school, much less obtain a degree. I had never, ever returned to see her. Since I was the only kid and my father passed away when I was still very little, I inherited my mother's house when she passed away. She and my father had purchased the house from her parents when they were married, and it was the same place where I had grown up and where she had spent her youth. Owning the house didn't excite me. I remembered too many negative things about it. In addition, it was and always had been an unsightly old place. In a low-income neighborhood with similar rundown homes, a 2-story clapboard that is well over a century old. The area where it stood had once been one of the more affluent areas of the town where I grew up, so it had likely been a pleasant place to live at one point. However, that was before the Great Depression, and the area had already experienced economic decline long before I was born, if not before my parents were. I planned to sell the property because I had no interest in retaining it, but before I did, I made the long overdue decision to return home and have one more look at my childhood house. I wasn't so much motivated by nostalgia or a sense of duty to my family. I was just interested in learning how my mother had lived out her final years and wanted to inspect the house to see if there was anything I wanted to take before it was put up for sale. I'm always busy at work, so I didn't find time to take a few days off until last month, which was 3 months after her funeral. A week or so before Thanksgiving, I finally made the hour-long trek back to the village where I had grown up. It was a gloomy, dismal day. The old area had not altered much. It was still as gloomy and destitute as I had remembered, with the same run-down houses, little, messy lawns, weedy, cracked sidewalks, and uneven, badly kept streets. I parked next to the curb and stepped out, pausing to look at the house I hadn't seen in more than 20 years. Peeling paint, sagging gutters, a decaying foundation, and fractured window panes made it appear even more desolate and filthy than I remembered as a child, like a testament to all the poverty and despair I had endured there, everything I had gone to college to avoid, swearing I would never be as poor as my parents had been. It strangely stood out in even stronger contrast to its virtually identical dilapidated neighbors. I already felt bad about returning. I sighed as I grudgingly ascended the walkway to the front door and used the key that my mother's executor had given me following her funeral to unlock it. I went inside and started looking around the house. It was strikingly unaltered. Everything appeared to be the same except for my mother's replacement of the outdated analog TV in the living room with a contemporary flat screen at one time. The fading wallpaper, gaudy trinkets, and worn-out furniture are all the same. I went upstairs and stopped at my mother's doorway as I made my way down the small hallway. The dreary bedroom was illuminated by dim sunshine that streamed in through the worn drapes. I gazed at the bed where she had passed away, the sinking, naked mattress. The bedside table was still packed with her meds. For a few minutes I stood there thinking, and then I went on. I then proceeded to my former bedroom. My mother had converted it into a storage room at some point after I had gone out. My dresser and bed were gone. The posters that had formerly adorned my walls were also in disarray. Spare towels and extra toiletries were now stored on the shelves that once held my high school sports trophies. I momentarily wondered if she had thrown them out or put them in the attic. The air had a musty smell. I went to the dusty, naked window and looked out at the dull afternoon of late fall. The only sound in the house was my own breathing. Unlike me, my mother had never been able to leave this dreary place where she had died alone. The air itself was heavy with unpleasant recollections. Here, nothing positive had ever occurred. I muttered, "I finally came home, Mom," my voice trailing off as I said it. My eyes began to sting from weeping. I felt a great deal of sadness and regret that we had never made amends while there was still time, or had been closer during her final years, even if I still didn't grieve her as I probably should have. I didn't want to keep anything here. I went downstairs from my old bedroom. I'm not sure what prompted me to enter the basement. I wouldn't have been interested in anything down there. I could have gone home at that very moment, just as easily. I had previously inspected the rest of the house, and I knew I would never return, so perhaps it was simply a matter of wanting to be thorough. In the kitchen, between the pantry and the refrigerator, was the basement entrance. I flicked on the light, opened it, and went down the groaning wooden stairs to the bottom. The kitchen was just below the basement. Little more than a walk-in closet, the space was dank and had low ceilings. A concrete floor and rough stone walls are softly lit by a solitary naked light bulb. With the exception of the washing and dryer, a shelf with cleaning supplies, and a few antique tools occupying a corner, it was largely empty. I took a fleeting glance around. I couldn't help but smile a little as I turned to face the back wall. Still there, a massive canvas mural that featured the black silhouettes of jitterbugging 1950s youths dancing against a white backdrop has dominated the basement's rear wall for as long as I could remember. I couldn't figure out why my grandparents, who had probably owned the house before my parents, had placed it there. Perhaps it was a pathetic attempt to provide some color to such a gloomy area. For whatever reason, it remained after all these years, albeit with severe fading, the canvas filthy, mildewed, and ragged with age. I turned to leave the basement and the house while still grinning, but something caught my attention just in time. Perplexed, I walked up and knelt down to have a better look. Over the years, the bottom of the ancient mural had curled up a few inches and pulled away from the wall, most likely as a result of the basement's moisture. What was exposed was wood rather than naked stone. Curious, I grabbed the mural's tattered edge and pulled it up further, revealing more wood as the rotten canvas tore a bit. I was momentarily confused by what I was witnessing. I was astonished when it finally hit me. Just a door. Behind the dated, ugly mural that had been there for God only knew how many years was a secret entrance. After making this discovery, I had a dozen queries, the main ones being, this door was hidden by whom? For what reason was it concealed? The most crucial question is, what was the opposite of it? I was so excited that I grabbed the mural without thinking and pulled it as hard as I could, ripping it off the basement's back wall and revealing the hidden door. I just stood there, looking, stunned. A few minutes later, I realized I hadn't turned off the key ring. I began cleaning the other gunslinger's frames. In some ways, the entrance seemed even older than the house itself, built from hefty, thick slabs of wood joined by iron bands. It had a rounded top. There was a big iron pull ring instead of a knob. It resembled a door from a castle from the Middle Ages. It was tied to the wall with a hasp that held an antique padlock that nonetheless looked rather new. The big manila envelope that had been stapled to the door, rather than the door itself, was what startled me the most. My name was meticulously printed in fading lettering on the envelope, along with the following statement in large block letters: "Never open this door, for the love of God." I opened the manila packet and took a hard look at it. It appeared to have been left there not long ago. It appeared to have existed for many years, possibly even decades, perhaps since I was a very small child. It was my mother's handwriting, and I knew it. The envelope felt as though it contained a paper of some sort. I read the frightening warning on the envelope: "Never open this door, for the love of God." Then, at the enigmatic door, the antiquated-looking, misplaced door that had long been concealed in the house where I grew up, and finally, back at the envelope I was holding. I was completely perplexed. Never open this door, for God's sake. Naturally, being the fool that I was, I prioritized unlocking the door I was specifically told not to open before even opening the envelope to look at its contents, despite the love of the Supreme Being. Who could blame me, though? Regardless of the possible repercussions, who in my position could have resisted the urge to act directly against such a serious decree? You know, curiosity killed the cat. In my former home, there was a locked door that I had never known existed. Of course, there was a reason it had been kept a secret. Whatever my mother had left for me in the envelope most likely included specifics about that reason. Although I could have spent some time reading the contents of the envelope to get an explanation, I honestly didn't feel like doing so. I had to be satisfied right away. I wanted to answer this mystery as quickly and directly as possible. I had to get that damn door open. And from where I was, both by choice and manifesting, everything about the way the envelope arrived and what was inside was similar to mine. I examined the padlock. After all this time, I had no chance of finding the key. A search of the house is useless because, as I discovered following closer study, the keyhole had been plugged with solder. I glanced at the rusted, ancient tools strewn about in the basement corner. I searched them in the hopes of finding a crowbar or some other tool to break the hasp off. I discovered a bigger bolt cutter instead, which was much better. Excellent, excellent. I unlocked the bolt cutters and attached the blades to the shackle of the padlock. I managed to break the padlock with some difficulty. I threw it away and took hold of the iron pull ring. I didn't know what I was going to discover beyond the door. My mind raced through a crazy array of potential outcomes, ranging from dead bodies to buried valuables. I had to tell myself that Gerardo Rivera had likely felt this same just before he opened Al Capone's secret vault, in order to control my exhilaration. I took a minute to prepare myself for whatever revelation I was about to make, and then I pulled hard. The door must have been closed for, well, God only knew how long, but it opened surprisingly easily. The hinges swung silently and smoothly. I opened it completely and looked at nothing through the doorway. He sobbed one night after bedtime and eventually told my mother what had happened nearly 2 years earlier. He had heard someone talking to him from the shadows when he opened the door. It was not a menacing or frightening voice. The voice was friendly. He even knew the voice. My mom said, "Whose voice?" to him. My uncle had stumbled to her Captain Kangaroo, referring to a well-liked children's television program of the era that he had enjoyed. Captain Kangaroo was the one. He addressed me specifically. He invited me into the treasure house so we could play together. He had entered the unknown by passing through the shadowy doorway. End quote. My mother had asked him nervously, "What did you see in there?" For a number of extended periods, my uncle had been silent. His cheeks were wet with tears. He forced the words out, and my mother saw the horror mounting in his eyes. The treasure house wasn't the location. Captain Kangaroo wasn't inside. There are things in there, he gasped out after pausing to swallow. In the shadows. Things that are seen but invisible. That statement, things you can see but can't see, had perplexed my mother, but my uncle hadn't, or maybe couldn't explain it any more clearly. My entire body felt cold when I read those words, like hundreds of ice cubes pressing on my flesh. Things that are seen but invisible. My uncle informed her that he had been unable to locate the doorway leading back to the basement because he had been lost in the shadows with those items, being pursued by them, fleeing from them, and hiding from them. It's bigger in there than you think, he continued. There is no end to it. Till he had wandered through it. By sheer happenstance, out of that terrible, godless darkness, he admitted to her that he had likely only spent no more than an hour inside, but that time is different inside. He felt as though he had been imprisoned there for years, if not centuries. My uncle confided in my mother that he was unable to bear the memories of his ordeal any longer. He claimed that he felt as though he had been imprisoned in that hidden underground room for all eternity and had never left. After giving her a hug, kissing her, and apologizing, he left her room. My mother was shocked, terrified, and perplexed by his last words, which were, "I'm sorry." She never saw her brother alive again after that. That same night, he had cut his wrists in his bed using his father's straight razor, which he had borrowed from the bathroom. The age of my uncle was 12. End quote. What her brother had told her the night before he committed himself, she had never shared with her parents. She didn't believe they could handle it, because they were already so overcome with terror and despair. However, they must have assumed that whatever she had gone through in the cellar had something to do with his death. The rest of their children were strongly forbidden from ever going down there again, and the entrance had been barricaded. The only person who had ever gone into the basement to wash the laundry was my grandmother, and even then she made an effort to visit as little as possible. As my mother unfortunately discovered early on, my grandparents forbade them from discussing my uncle or his passing, and they would be smacked if they even spoke his name. They wanted to move on from the whole awful experience and forget about him. My mother used to wonder why her parents had stayed in the house after what had happened, rather than selling it and moving someplace else for a new beginning. She figured that was likely due to their financial situation. However, when she married my father as a young woman years later, her parents, who were getting older and less healthy, asked her if she and her new husband would inherit the house from them when they passed away. According to my mother, my grandma pleaded with them to move in, rather than making an offer. My grandmother had told my mother that she couldn't bear the idea of the house going to someone else, someone who was unaware of the basement door. But my mother couldn't believe her parents would want it to stay in the family after the loss they had experienced there, someone who may have kids as well. I suddenly understood after reading that, comprehended everything. As a child, I could see why my mother had been so controlling and intrusive. She was overly protective of me. Why had she always been so serious and moody? Why she had spent all those years until the day of her death living in that dark mansion with its weight of sorrow and bitter memories. It made sense to me why she had concealed the door behind that ancient mural with a warning in case I discovered it after she had left. That door had been under her protection, protecting the door so that another poor, gullible person wouldn't open it and be drawn into the shadows by a recognizable, reliable voice. Just like her brother had been. I also realized that I would never be able to sell the house. For the remainder of my life, I had to hold it in my custody and assume my mother's role as its guardian. Beyond the ancient wooden door, something is hidden in the shadows, something awful that is out of place in our world.